Okay, I think we're about ready here.
You didn't start, did you? Okay, I didn't.
Yeah, it's a new one. Everybody was just couldn't want this to be. Nobody said we couldn't.
Better. Okay, better. Better. Okay, good evening, everyone. Glad to see everyone can make it tonight. I think we have a real nice program lined up tonight. Tradition, before we start, I always like to introduce members of the staff, members who contribute each and every meeting, and starting with Co-President Jim Hammond. I just wanted to wave. Co-Vice President Ellen Wilson. Co-Vice President Betty Conley.
Right here.
Over there. Treasurer Evelyn Young, she's not here tonight. Jean Vinstock in the back there. Toby Chapman over there. Audrey Glickman behind the camera. And Tony and Davina's not here. And also membership coordinator Stanley Klein. Back there. Okay, first thing here, our 2020 membership drive is well underway. The dues are very reasonable, $15 for individuals and $25 for people. And we encourage everyone to sign up as soon as possible. With declining book sales, we depend more on membership dues to keep going. And every penny we can cut is good. We send out reminder notices in mid-January, so if people could renew by then, it would save us the cost of postage. There's applications in a desk in the back, and you can submit them here or by mail. You can also make an application online at the Squirrel Hill Historical Society website. And payment can be made by cash, check, or our new PayPal account. Also in the back desk there, we have a number of books dealing with local history. Of course, we have the 2 History of Squirrel Hill books. And I think they make excellent holiday gifts with a broad-based appeal. There's also the book of Pittsburgh Bridges by Todd and Helen. Mill Hunks and Renegades by Nita Kalina. Pockets by Audrey Glickman, on the camera there. Number of books by our speaker tonight, one of which is Sophie, of course, referring to Sophie Masloff. And there's 2 Steel City Jews books, 1 and 2, both dealing with different time periods, and a Jewish Pittsburgh book. And there's also an application for Petroleum Pioneers of Pittsburgh back at the table. So if you're interested, that's where they're at. Next is our new email address has been completed. We moved from Gmail to Hotmail, from Hotmail to Gmail. And a letter would have been sent out to each of the members. So if you didn't get one with a new email address, let us know and we'll fix whatever the problem might be. Before we get started, I'd like to mention some of the upcoming presentations. Next month's speaker is Tammy Epps founder of HomesteadHebrews.com. Her talk's entitled Homestead and Squirrel Hill, and a look at a surprisingly close relationship between the community of Homestead and Squirrel Hill. February, we'll have Elizabeth Work, professor of art history at Chatham University, and the title being The Art Collecting of Pittsburgh's Gilded Age Titans. And this talk will look at the collecting practices of Pittsburgh's big three, industrial age, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon, and the impact it had in the city. In March, we have our own Vice President, Helen Wilson, doing a talk entitled The Convoluted History of Squirrel Hill's Roads. And it looks at the history of more than 200 streets, avenues, places, courts, ways, etc. in Squirrel Hill. And if I know Helen, she has probably personally walked in every one of them just to research that article. And then April's program is titled The History of Smithfield and Homewood Cemeteries, presented by Jenny Benford, the Director of Programming at the Homewood Cemetery Historical Fund. And she spent nearly 2 decades studying and documenting the history of these two landmark cemeteries. That leads us to tonight's speaker, Barbara Burstin, faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. She's also a member of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. And her courses deal with the American Jewish experience in this country and the Holocaust. And she's now teaching a new course in the history of Pittsburgh. She's written several books, including Jewish Pittsburgh, Steel City Jews, 2 versions of that one, different time periods. And she's also produced a film, The Jewish Legacy in Pittsburgh. Her most recent works are subject of tonight's meeting. It's titled The Irrepressible Sophie Masloff. And if you've ever met Sophie or dealt with Sophie, you know that's a perfect title. She was quite the character. And without further ado, oh, and also there's a nice write-up about that book in yesterday's Trib newspaper. If you've seen it, it's well worth reading. So, next our speaker, Barbara Burstin.
Thank you. I see we have a lot of people here tonight. I attribute the attendance here to Sophie because I think most of us knew her, and I think we're interested in learning about her. I must tell you that when I broached this subject to some people who I'm very close to, including my husband, he said, why are you doing that? Why are you writing a book on Sophie? And some other people said that too. I mean, after all, she was a caretaker. What did she do? You know, why are you spending time on that? And I thought about it, and I said, after all, she was the first female, the first Jewish mayor of the city of Pittsburgh. Surely there's a story there. And so I didn't listen to him and to them. And so here I am, here you are. I've spent 3 years on this project. I didn't think I would spend that much time, but I really got into it. Interestingly enough, Sophie threw out all her papers. There is very little that she has in her personal papers aside from some recipes, which I thought I might try. Some letters perhaps, but not very much. And she threw them out because she figured nobody really would care. She was very humble. She didn't really think she was any big deal. And this was part of her personality. But it made, for the historian, a really big problem. Because I didn't have the wherewithal to research. So I had to First of all, I went to the contemporary newspapers of the time. Several reporters obviously covered city, though that's in the days when there were newspapers on a regular basis. We all remember those days. So the Press and the Post-Gazette were two very important sources for me. But I interviewed about 70 people who were very close to her, who knew her, and who could really give me some perspective. And as I interviewed these people, I realized that many of them who were carryovers from the Caligiuri administration, who didn't even think that they would continue with Sophie because they didn't know Sophie, they weren't sure about her reputation, they didn't think they would last, and they did last. And not only did they last, but they grew to love her. They respected her, and they were thrilled to be working with her. And many of these people were not politicos. They were not people who needed patronage. They were people who could earn a lot more money in the private sector, but who chose to stay in government service at a reduced salary in order to work with Sophie because they so respected what she did. So I came away after this whole research really with a much deeper appreciation for this woman and what she did. So let me talk. I have some PowerPoint. We'll see whether it's going to work. We keep our fingers crossed, but I can start anyway. And so let me tell you something about her background, because maybe some of you know, if you have seen the recent movie by Ken Love. Has anybody seen that movie? All right, some of you have seen it. It's going to be shown again. It was supposed to be shown this weekend actually at the Regent Square, but you know what happened to the Regent Square. But it's a movie called Jewish Memories of the Hill. And Ken Love did this. And what I'm so pleased about, I did this film 20 years ago, and I interviewed Sophie, interviewed High Richmond, interviewed Rabbi Pupko, introduced Frank Bolden, interviewed Frank Bolden, who was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier. And Ken was able to use those film clips in this movie, Jewish Memories of the Hill. So you will see Sophie. You will see some of these other people who were filmed 20 years ago. But Sophie grew up in the Hill. In this movie, she takes us back to Robert Street, where she lived. It was a very poor neighborhood. She was the daughter of Romanian immigrants. Her father died when she was 5 years old, and her mother was left with 4 children. Very difficult upbringing, very difficult circumstances. Everybody had to work, whatever they could do. Sophie describes it, and she never wanted to talk about it because she never wanted people to feel sorry for herself. So she never really, even her aides said that she never really talked about her past. But it was quite difficult. And if I could tell you, like, for instance, she never had any store-bought clothes. Everything was hand-me-downs. They had stale bread. I mean, just basic kinds of living. Her mother basically worked in a stogie factory, but then when that industry kind of collapsed, she, from my understanding, basically became a cleaning lady. And that's how she supported her family, and the older kids worked whenever they could and brought in money. Sophie married when she was, in 1939, she was about 22, I guess, at the time. She married Jack Masloff, who she obviously had a big crush on. She used to go past his house when she went to Fifth Avenue High School. He had been married before and was older than Sophie. And he was apparently quite the guy, but he never really was able to make a very substantial living. And so Sophie, both in her married life and in her early upbringing, was struggling. And this is a woman, you know, it's a rags to riches story, but she never had any riches. The family lived on her salary, which was about $64,000 as a mayor of the city of Pittsburgh at the time. I don't know what it is now. Is it? I have no idea now.
More than
sure
that.
It's more. But she didn't have much. after she was mayor, she was quite popular, and many of you might remember the ads that she did for various Schneider's Dairy and blanking, IT and some of the others.
Center.
Pardon? That's right, Appliance Square Warehouse. And she donated all that to charity. She never used her position for self-aggrandizement, which of course is something we can appreciate now more than ever. Leave that one alone. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that this is a woman who had really nothing going for her when she got into politics. She had no pedigree, she couldn't afford, college was certainly out of the question, she had to get to work. So she really had no pedigree, she had no wealth, she had no status in the community, either from her family, from her husband, nothing at all. And so she is a self-made woman, and she, through her own determination and her personality and her ambition, she rose to become mayor of the city of Pittsburgh. The vehicle that she chose to get out of the ghetto was politics. She loved politics. First of all, it was a way to get out of the ghetto because she could get, if she worked for the Democratic Party, which was her party, she could perhaps get a job, which she needed. So it was a economic opportunity, but it also was her passion because she loved people, as you know. She would meet, and I'm certain some of you have stories which I'd like to hear, but she would meet people on the street and, you know, hi, how are you? You know, and how are you, and how's your husband? And she would remember names, which those of us who are a little more senior can only admire. Who remembers names when you get older? And Sophie absolutely remembered names, and she would ask. I have a woman who dated Bill Coyne wrote to me and told me that when she started dating Bill, she called him Billy Coyne, or congressperson, Sophie interviewed her because she wanted to make sure that Kathy was a good Catholic, that she went to Mass, that she could have chicken dinners with Bill, that she could really be a good companion to him, and she was very happy that Sophie finally approved. But she was a people person, so politics was her métier, and the Democratic Party was the party because, after all, the Democratic Party in the 1930s, when Sophie now comes of age, is the party of the underdog, is the party of the working man, is the party of the person who's striving to get ahead, and that was Sophie. Davy Lawrence, of course, was one of her heroes. John Kane, who she was able to get a job with. These were people who she greatly admired, and her job was to build the party, especially women's organizations. David Lawrence thought that was extremely important, and of course it was. So Sophie really volunteered and got in at the bottom and really worked and made a lot of contacts, and people loved her. I love the story that Sophie became head of the Catholic Youth Association. What Jewish girl becomes head of the Catholic Youth Association? But of course this was because she was so warm and friendly, people loved her. But it didn't hurt, of course, that her best friend, at least initially, through much of her career, was Rita Wilson Kane, who happened to marry John Kane's son. So Rita Wilson Kane was a power in her own right, and Sophie was a good friend, and so she clearly set the stage, prepared the way for Sophie to rise. But Sophie wouldn't have risen unless she had her own personality. So Sophie ultimately gets a job. That's how she meets Rita Wilson Kane, who becomes Kane. She meets Rita Wilson as they are both, as young women, trying to get a job in John Kane's office. They both do. They work for him until he says, look, I don't know if I'm going to be elected. I don't know if I want to be elected. You need to get a job that's secure, that can guarantee your income. and so he kind of helped her get a job as a clerk in the in the Court of Common Pleas, and she was there for decades. And it's very interesting because when she ran for mayor, which she is going to do in her own right in 1989, hopefully we'll get there on the slideshow, all these, one of her aides, George Whitmer, couldn't understand why all these lawyers were contributing to Sophie Masloff's campaign. And the reason is because when they were young lawyers, Sophie was in the Court of Common Pleas and helped them pick their juries and was so nice to them. And now, how many years later, 30, 40 years later, they are paying back by contributing to her campaign. Robin Burstin, who was the campaign manager for Tom Murphy, could never get a lawyer to contribute to Tom Murphy's campaign. They were all given to Sophie Masloff. Another funny story, Orrin Hatch, the retired mayor, senator from the state of Utah, was in Pittsburgh when Sophie was mayor, and was on stage, and he sees Sophie, and he runs to Sophie, and he picks her up, which is a formidable feat in itself. He picks her up and gives her a hug, and everybody's looking. What does Orrin Hatch have to do with Sophie Masloff? The fact of the matter is that Orrin Hatch graduated from the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and when he was a young lawyer, Sophie helped him pick his first jury. And he remembered all these years later. So, okay, so Sophie now has been involved. She becomes president of the Federation of Democratic Women, a statewide organization. She is known, she has contacts, and she feels that she is now ready to serve in a new capacity. And in 1970, she wants to run for city council. Amy Ballinger, though, beats her out. It's a story, but whatever. In 1976, Amy Ballinger is retiring, and I don't know if any of you remember Amy Ballinger, but she goes on, she retires because she didn't want to reveal her finances because she was in the midst of a divorce, and she goes off and becomes a comedian on a cruise ship. Now that might set the stage for what we're going to talk about, city council. Okay. So let's see if this is going to work now. I don't know if it can work from here, but, oh, it is going to work. Okay, so, all right. All right, I'm going to start with this one. Okay, this is a picture that Rob Rogers did. I'm going to try and show you some of the caricatures that were done at the time. But this is a picture of city council. And when Sophie gets on, it is literally a circus. Some of you might remember, some of you might have personal memories, which I'd love to hear, by the way, okay? Either tonight or email me, because I love these stories. It was called a circus, but in one of my presentations, Cynthia Donnell, who was a young lawyer at the time, had the responsibility, when the main guy wasn't there, of attending city council meetings and being the parliamentarian, okay, whatever she was, okay? And she was terrified that she would be called on because she was a young lawyer and didn't feel she knew, but whatever, that's aside from the point. But she describes city council, okay? City council, and this is what she wrote me, city council was called a circus, but it actually was worse than that. It was a screaming match. Michelle Madoff, who is shown here upside down with her feet upside down. You see, I don't have a pointer, but you can see her. Michelle Madoff monopolized the meeting. She refused to give up the floor despite being off agenda and being told she was out of order. Gavel banging was constant. Her tactics often ended with Michelle and Jeep de Pasquale shouting each other down, with Jeep going on about one issue and Michelle going on about another at full volume simultaneously, each refusing to concede to the other. Other council members would often walk out. Okay? Sophie sat. Sophie did not responds, Sophie did not get involved. Michelle Madoff wound up calling Sophie a lump of clay. Okay, but, and she was convinced that people voted for Masloff thinking that they were voting for Madoff, and Madoff was convinced the other way around. Okay, but Sophie really didn't want to put Michelle down because Sophie wanted to promote women. Her style was not Michelle's. She never considered herself a women's liberator. She never, you know, burning bras, that kind of thing. That wouldn't have worked anyway. But Bella Abzug was somebody who Sophie would not appreciate because Bella and Michelle were loud, almost obnoxious. They were too strident for Sophie. Sophie's style was much softer. And so she didn't want to put Michelle down, but she also didn't want to have anything to do with Michelle. One of Sophie's, I guess, bodyguard, police guard, whatever you want to call him, told me a funny story. He said that he was told when Sophie was in her office that he should come in and warn her if Michelle was heading her way, that she would duck out the back door. Anyway, so that's an interesting relationship. So City Council, where's my thing? All right, City Council, Sophie is on, and this is in 1988. She decides to run for president of City Council. And Dick Caligiuri is very supportive. At this point, Dick Caligiuri knows that he has amyloidosis, but he doesn't believe that he's going to die in office. He really thinks he's going to be able to make it. He puts on a big, strong presence as much as, he was pretty slight to begin with, and he loses even more weight, but he's going to fulfill his term. But he wants Sophie as president because he feels Sophie is a compromiser, in this sea of discord. And here is a cartoon, and it's on this screen, it's not coming in so well, but it says, "I'm introducing a little dignity and decorum. Dignity is on my right." And if you see this slide, there are two bulldogs. That's Rob Rogers' impression of what Sophie is going to deal with. Okay? Here we are, of course. We know what's going to happen just a few months later. After Sophie is president, Dick Caligiuri dies suddenly. We all remember that if we lived in Pittsburgh at that time. In May of 1988, he dies. And Sophie, needless to say, is traumatized. It's a shock. She never expected him to die. Otherwise, she said she might never become president of council. But she is able quickly to recover, which is really fascinating. I talk about that. She's really able to think to herself that she can do this. I can do this. It's like Rosie the Riveter. I can do this job, okay, even though it's been thrust on me in such tragic circumstances. Funny story. So Sophie goes shopping at Giant Eagle. You know, she lived in Washington Plaza, then Beechwood Boulevard, and then Maxim Tower. She goes shopping in Greenfield Giant Eagle, and she realizes she doesn't have any cash with her, but she has a check. So she wants to write a check, and the guy says, what do you call him, the supermarket, the checkout guy says, well, you need to show identification. What is your place of employment? And Sophie says, I'm the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh. And the guy looks at his buddy and he says, this old broad thinks she's the mayor of Pittsburgh. Anyway, but Sophie overcame. Okay, in 1989, okay, I'm going to have to explain this slide. Sophie runs for mayor on her own, okay? And she runs against, and I'm sure many of you remember this, she runs against 5 men. And here we have Rob Rogers again Anderson, I forget his first name, maybe Gary, I'm not sure what his first name was. Who am I and why am I here? Because nobody knew who he was, but he was running for mayor. Then we have Sophie. Okay, I'll describe what she says in a minute. Then we have Tom Flaherty. I'll never put friends on the payroll, and of course he was notorious for absolutely doing that, and Sophie really had a problem with him over this. Bird Brown, if you do, I'd cut him, says Bird Brown. Tom Murphy, Superman costume, if you can see that. I'll save you all from this. This is a kind of play on Tom Murphy, who thinks he's the big shot, make the world safe for democracy. And then Frank Luchino saying, ribbit, ribbit. The race got rather bitter at the end. Sophie was not a debater. She really was not good in that kind of circumstance. And Frank Luchino, as many of you remember, was her primary opposition, at least at the time. He outspent her about 3-1. And she didn't, initially, she didn't want to be in any of the debates, but then finally she had to kind of do it. And there was one debate where she was determined, she had this line prepared, that's like being called ugly by a frog, okay? Well, Frank Luchino turns to Sophie. Apparently each candidate had a chance to ask something to the other candidate, and Frank Luchino turns to Sophie and says, don't you think all the candidates should be ethical, something like that. And Sophie responds, that's like being called ugly by a frog, okay? Out of nowhere, the audience is like, what? But they break out laughing because it's so funny, and people think that the election turned on that particular thing, because people love Sophie because she was fun. And Luchino really blew that election. And it's interesting, and again, I love commentary, but it's interesting because one of the people I interviewed told me a story that was so emblematic of the difference between Sophie and Frank Luchino. They're at a campaign event, and both of them are there. And Sophie and Frank are sitting on the dais. Frank spends the entire time sitting on the dais and speaks for a half hour. Sophie spends 5 minutes on the dais and spends the rest of the time meeting everybody in the audience, just schmoozing and saying hello and so forth. And that was the difference. Anyway, whatever your perception was, Sophie wins in 1989, and this was the cartoon that showed it. Leapfrog, this slide, leaping frog over Frank Luchino. By the way, Frank Luchino, who, really decent guy, I called him to speak to him. He didn't want to, is this on? Yeah. He didn't want to talk particularly, but he really felt, in retrospect, he feels that his loss was the best thing that ever happened to him, because he had heart trouble, and he felt that if he had become mayor, he wouldn't have taken care of himself, and he might have died of a heart attack. So he really kind of put a good spin on the fact that he lost the election. Anyway, and now he is a judge, right? He's a good guy. Anyway, okay. Okay. This is a cartoon. Go, Yuns guys, scratch their eyes out. Okay, I can't say it like Sophie. By the way, you all know Sophie's voice. I don't know if it's going to come across here on the sound system. I can't imitate it. But one writer described it as scratching paint off a fence. Another one, Dennis Roddy, described it, and this one is really brutal, but maybe it describes it. Her voice was like a cat in a microwave oven turned up on high. I know, that's what I have to say. Anyway, this comment that she made was really when Brian Beasley was taking over Coppers, a British corporation, and she was very upset because this was yet another Pittsburgh corporation that was leaving town. And so she said this in jest, but, you know, it reflected the problem that Pittsburgh was going through, the economic loss of major corporations and major jobs. Not good, this slide. Okay, this was a slide dealing with a strike, the strike of the Port Authority workers. And Sophie was able to intervene in that strike. Tom Forster had been trying to negotiate between the union and the Port Authority and was not succeeding. Sophie was getting all kinds of messages, you know, I can't get to the doctor, I can't get to my job, we're suffering, the buses aren't running. She would be picking up people in her car when she would go to work. Things were very bad, and she was able to intervene. I'm not going to go into the specifics. And she got an injunction and got the workers, the drivers, back to their job. And Tom Forster was furious at her for meddling, quote unquote, in the negotiation that he was doing. Sophie was furious at Tom Forster because she always believed a man, and I've heard this recently, somebody said this too, that women meddle. That was, you know, that it was kind of a put down, how dare a woman get into this, and he used language that she just found just off the deep end. Anyway, so that was one of the strikes that she had to deal with. Okay, this one you might know what I'm talking about here. This is the proposal. If you build it, she's talking about Clemente Field. She's talking about a new vision for a baseball-only park on the North Shore, which at that time was the North Side, which needed development, which needed a whole boost in the arm. Sophie had this vision, and here is what you're going to be nuts. You got to be nuts. Where will people park? Who will pay for it? What about Three River Stadium? And of course, 10 years later, we have PNC Park. Again, Sophie felt, and she withdrew that proposal. She withdrew it within 2 weeks. And she, because of the outrage and the ridicule that she got, and she always felt that if a man had proposed that park, it would have been a lot better received. But the fact that a woman proposed it, that did it in. So again, this was probably, Sophie had a lot of strikes against her, okay? Clearly I talked about she had no wealth, no kind of support by the business elite. They looked down on her. She didn't have that kind of support. She was a woman, she was Jewish, she was elderly, she didn't have a college education. You know, she was 70 when she became mayor. Not that that's any problem in today's candidate show, but you know, at that time Caligari was what, in his early 50s or something, so you know, at that time it was different. Being a woman, though, she felt was the biggest challenge she had to face. That she was really ridiculed. Remember, she's in the days where you go into the Kane Club by the side door. Women are not allowed in the front door. Okay, and she talked about that. You know, how dare them? But she stood up to them, and that was, you know, she said she just didn't care. Okay, they want to put her down, fine, that's their business, but she's not going to put herself down. Anyway, this was the baseball thing. Let me keep going. All right, I'm going to skip that again. It's another cartoon about, wow, these really aren't coming out. Okay, this one is about Tom Murphy, and I'm sorry, but basically Tom Murphy and Sophie now do not have, you know, she has a problematic relationship with Tom Forster. She's going to have one also with Tom Murphy. Tom Murphy is going to blast her for not having any vision, and yet when she envisions the baseball park on the north side, he blasts her for that ridiculous proposal. Rita Wilson Kane, to the day she died, would not talk to Tom Murphy because of the insult the way he treated Sophie, basically ignoring her, not acknowledging her in any way. But Sophie made up with her, I think, with him. I think basically by 2000, Tom had invited Sophie to hold the Bible when he was sworn in as mayor. And I interviewed Tom, and in fact, he's in my, in the book, in someplace in forward, where he acknowledges that she laid the groundwork for him, that she kept the city solvent so that he could go off and do what he did. Okay, let me keep going. Okay, I want to talk about Sophie's accomplishments, and I gotta watch time here. What time is it?
5 after 8.
Wow, okay. Sophie did a lot. And the first thing we have to recognize is that she kept the city solvent at a time when the steel industry is collapsing, corporations are fleeing. Pittsburgh in the 1980s, early 1990s is in economic dire situation. Some of her aides called it, we're on the precipice. One man called it, we're in Armageddon. Philadelphia is going bankrupt. New York City is going bankrupt. The federal government has cut back all federal funds that Caligiuri was able to use for his Renaissance in the early 1980s. The state is in trouble. They're not contributing funds. Sophie has to deal with a declining population, with manufacturing problems, economic problems, and she is insistent that we deal with this situation, cut expenses and so forth. It's very interesting. Joe Mystic, who was one of her aides in the article that was just mentioned about the Trib Review, mentioned that, for instance, her staff could not fly to Harrisburg. That was too expensive. They drove. You had to drive, okay? And Sophie believed that you balance your budget, just like she balanced her budget at home. So that was the most important thing, I think, that she kept the city solvent and so forth. Some other things that I'm just going to touch on. She developed Washington's Landing. She developed the Pittsburgh Technology Center on the 2nd Avenue, which was stalled. Crawford Square, the area on the hill. This was all she worked with Jake Mallions, who she really loved, and tragically he died during her administration. And perhaps the biggest thing that she did, which has not gotten recognized, which I found was something that her people really felt that she should, and that is the RAD, the Regional Asset District, okay? I think it's something like over $100 million that has gone into the coffers of various cultural arts institutions in this area. Sophie, it was a sales tax, a 1% sales tax that Pittsburgh couldn't levy unless the state agreed to it, unless the county agreed to it, and the surrounding municipalities, because it was a tax, okay? And nobody wanted to be accused of raising the tax, okay? Elsie Hillman and Dan Rooney were, what should I say? They approached, I'm putting it gently, Elsie Hillman does not just approach, she snags you. Tom Forrester, that he should go along with it, and Sophie was at the state level to get the state to even approve this whole project. And because Sophie had this contact, because she had this, you know, people just loved her and she had a way about herself, she got the state legislature to approve this proposition, and today we have this RAD tax, which has been a boon to this county because the city had been the only one who had been paying for the cost of the National Aviary, the Phipps Conservatory, the zoo, what am I missing, the Shenley Golf Course, but that was less. This RAD tax has really been a major resource for them and kept them afloat. So I want to make sure that Sophie is recognized for that. Let me just show you a couple of things real quickly now. This is her staff. Again, one thing I want to say, and I can't identify all of them here, but one thing I want to say is that many of the people were on Dick Caligiuri's staff, as I mentioned. When they were on Dick Caligiuri's staff, they were called aides. When these same people are on Sophie Masloff's staff, they're called handlers. Okay, in other words, she's not making the decision, they are, okay, the same people. So again, this is what Sophie has to deal with, being put down as if she doesn't make the decisions, and her aides to a man and woman said she was tough, she listened, and then she made the decision, and they respected what she did. This picture, okay, I don't think I'm going to show you this. This is a scene, I don't want to take the time. This is a scene of Sophie. How should I start? I don't know. Let's see, where's Audrey? Audrey, help. See if we can start this. I'm not sure it's going to work. This is a scene. Sophie is going to cut the wage tax. Let's see if this is going to work. And I want it to stop, so. You know what? Let's keep going.
I would like to welcome everyone.
Okay.
I would like to welcome everyone to City Council's 1989 tax hearing. And I would like a little silence, please.
That's Jack Wagner.
On December 7, 1989, Pittsburgh City Council convened to hear Mayor Masloff defend her tax swap proposal before an unruly crowd of more than 300 irate senior citizens. When the mayor announced her plan 3 weeks earlier, major players in Pittsburgh real estate blasted the proposal, making inflammatory statements
Michelle, of
about
course.
its attack on senior citizens. The tone of this hearing is largely a product of those statements.
Okay, 300 people are booing Sophie for lowering the wage tax and increasing the property tax. Okay, I don't want to take the time.
I'm only going to say this once. I'm only going to say this once. I would ask each and every person in the room to offer the dignity and respect to the mayor and any other speaker that comes to the microphone. We do not want any yelling or screaming. This council is here not for that today, but to listen to all of you. So please, permit each and every person to speak without interruption. Good morning.
Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the council, I come here today as a senior citizen myself. Can't you hear me? I come here today. Is that better? I come here today as a senior citizen myself. And I know better than anyone else about the financial burden we face. But I also know that if we don't attract young people and young families like your sons and daughters and like my daughter to this city, the tax burden is going to fall more and more on us older folks who will be left behind to pay more taxes and receive less in services.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay? So I want to show you two other things. Dave Crawley did this when Sophie retired. Rita Wilson Kane on the right.
Sure had fun, so tip your top hat to all of that. Now that the cheering's done, you're everyone's grandma willing to share. Unusual trait to find in a mayor. When problems arose, you stepped in with both feet. I've got to admit, your plans were concrete, but still the job was to take it.
That's City Council.
Pushing the programs you hammered away.
Practically 18 hours a day.
Improving your city, you pitched in with pride.
An expert. I moonlight. I paint on the side.
Remember that bright expressionism the night we made the Hollywood scene? Awaiting the talk show, we knew you could make it.
I'm very calm, and I'm ready to take it.
Poor old Pat Sajak, how could he know your tenure as mayor would outlast its show? On a day when the cup of Lord Stanley ascends, who else but Sophie could upstage the pens? When it came to pronouncements, you were no jackstraw.
Let's go! Who's the big apple? Who's the big apple sauce?
That's what she says about a Koch.
Though I've got to agree, a map of this city has never helped me.
I ain't gonna go.
Can
Don't miss that voice and the mishaps it renders. Remember Bruce Bedspring and all those dead-enders? When it came to the beer biz, you were a sensation. You're long overdue for a big celebration. But one final word before popping that cork. Sophie, why don't you come to New York?
Okay, one more.
Flags are flying at half-staff tonight, including this one at the City County Building, in memory of former Pittsburgh Mayor Sophie Masloff, who died this morning at the age of 96. Wow. Good evening, everyone. I'm Matt Belanger. She's often described as iconic, colorful, and beloved. Masloff was the 56th mayor of Pittsburgh and was also the city's first female and Jewish executive. Tonight, Pittsburgh's Action News 4 anchor Sally Wiggin helps us remember the life and legacy of this woman who made such a difference in our city, including how she was thrust into the spotlight by the death of another beloved Pittsburgh politician.
Will you faithfully discharge the duties of your office of mayor to the best of your ability? I will, and I do.
She was 70 years old. While some might have considered Sophie Masloff an unlikely replacement for the popular Caligari, the terminally ill mayor had supported Masloff for council president.
Mayor had a big control over the council, and he asked them if they would vote for me, and they did, and that's how I became mayor. I'm sure because it was Caligari who wanted me.
Masloff had served in Pittsburgh City Council since 1976, but some former colleagues were less than welcoming now.
I felt that I had a hostile council. I just felt that they were resentful. And I was extremely self-conscious the first few meetings.
But the people loved her, and she successfully ran for a full term as mayor.
Let me say, it is a great personal honor to be the mayor of this city. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support.
Heady stuff for the woman born in the Hill District to Romanian Jewish immigrants. Some saw her as quirky, yet endearing. But the Jewish grandmother who appeared on national talk shows and in the Wall Street Journal was politically savvy. She lowered the city's wage tax and pushed new development in the Hills Crawford Square and the Pittsburgh Technology Center.
I lowered the wage tax the second year I was in office from 4 mills to 3.5 mills because I believed then that the wage tax may influence young people from moving into Pittsburgh.
But most of all, she was a visionary.
An old-fashioned, natural grass, open-ended baseball park to be built close by Three River Stadium.
Her Clemente Field proposal came a decade before PNC Park. But tragically, her husband of 52 years, Jack, died while she was in office. Masloff decided not to run for a second term. But she remained a force in state and national politics, attending every Democratic National Convention from 1960 to 2004. But at 93, Masloff was urged by doctors not to attend what would be Barack Obama's nomination.
The old gray mare. She ain't what she used to be, but I'm still going gray, and I'm going to die with my boots on. 3, 2, 1, off!
And perhaps her favorite tribute came 6 months before, on her 90th birthday. The unveiling of Sophie Masloff Way was in the shadow of the baseball park that she had dreamed of.
I appreciate this honor, although I really don't deserve it. I did what I was supposed to do.
Always. Right up until the end. Sally Wiggin, Pittsburgh's Action News 4.
Just a fun story. When Bill Clinton was running for office in 1992, he called Sophie on the telephone. He says, "Hello, Sophie, this is Bill Clinton." "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of Sheba." He had to call 3 times. And then when he came to Pittsburgh, they were mobbed in the Strip District because the two of them had this charisma and so forth, and hair, and so, a funny story. And I want to close because I just want to talk, Doris Kearns Goodwin, some time ago, wrote and talked about leadership. And she talked about characteristics: humility, ability to acknowledge errors, empathy, resilience, creating a team, ambition for something beyond oneself, the ability to grow. How do we define a leader? And Sophie might not have been the model that people might have thought about, but Sophie was a leader, and Sophie accomplished a lot, and she served the people who she really loved. And that, I think, is something that we really need to appreciate today, that she was there for people, she cared about people, that was her most important passion, and we miss her. So thank you very much. I'd love some stories. I don't know how much time we have, but let's see, questions, stories.
The Love movie, is that going to be shown?
What movie?
The movie about Sophie Masloff?
It's not a movie about Sophie, it's Jewish Memories of the Hill. Sophie is in it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'd love somebody to make a movie. I wanted a movie done of Sophie and Elsie. They were friends, you know. And Sophie could never understand why Elsie Hillman was a Republican, because she always supported Democratic causes, mostly. Yes?
Was she very self-conscious about not having been to college, and did she ever receive any honor?
I think she was. Yeah, she was self-conscious about it. That's why she didn't want to debate. You know, she knew her language wasn't the King's English. So she was self-conscious about that.
Did she receive any honorary degrees?
She was Pennsylvania's distinguished daughter. What do you call it? The distinguished daughter of Pennsylvania. But I don't think an academic degree. No academic degrees. Other questions, comments? Yes?
My first memories of her as a politician, or trying to get into some office, she sponsored cable television.
Oh yeah, that was a big deal. That was a big deal. Absolutely, it was a big deal.
The second thing that she accomplished.
That was when she was on city council.
Yeah. As mayor, I remember we named all the streets.
That's right.
I mean, even little alleys suddenly had a name on it.
Well, she was a housekeeper. She wanted everything to be neat. Remember the recycling program she also launched, and the street naming, and it was a very complicated thing because a lot of the names, you know, had changed and so forth. So that was an effort, but she promoted that absolutely. Yeah, Marlene.
Do you think that Joe Mystic didn't get the credit he deserved? I always perceived that he was like the power behind her.
She had, I don't know if Joe's any more than George Whitmer or Jim Turner. I mean, she had a group of powerhouse people, Mary Conturo. She had a group of really high-class professional people.
I think he was a person that could have made a lot of money in these.
Oh, absolutely. Well, they all could have.
They could have.
And in fact, Joe did leave to finally make some money in private law. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go.
Are there other public officials who picked up her mantra of being accessible and accomplished?
I don't know. You answer that.
I can't think of anybody that thought maybe your research.
I don't. You know, I don't think Tom Murphy had that openness that Sophie did. Caligari did, yeah. Current mayor, maybe. I mean, I'm not getting into that.
Yeah.
Anybody stories? Anybody work with Sophie or had
You
any?
remember the tunnel? I don't know what they call it. You know, that underground that we call it the T now or something. Didn't she propose that and everybody jumped on her?
No, that was Flaherty, Skybus.
No.
The subway.
No, I don't think that was true.
Because that opened in '85, Harvard opened in '85, and then the other part was like 2009.
Yeah, so that wasn't Sophie. Yeah, that wasn't Sophie. Yes.
We talk about her as the Jewish mayor, but her family was unaffiliated. And when she died, the family, or she, wanted to be buried from Temple Sinai. And Rabbi Gibson said, we only bury members. So they joined the synagogue for a year, so she could be buried from Temple Sinai.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was Temple Sinai.
It was Temple Sinai.
Where she was buried in their cemetery?
I don't know if she's buried
Yeah, no, I
in
don't
their
think she's buried in their cemetery.
The funeral.
The funeral was at Temple Sinai.
I don't know if she.
Yeah.
No,
No,
she
she-
might be at Homewood
she w-
Cemetery, I don't know where she is.
I forget. She was not religious, not particularly observant, although her mother was. She certainly grew up in a very kosher and observant home. But she herself was not particularly religious, but she was very committed. She was a cultural Jew. She was very committed, and in 1984, she actually went on a trip. Fred Frank led it. Lou Borman, if those names mean anything to you, they went to Soviet Union to support the refuseniks, the Jewish refuseniks, and it was a big deal. I mean, this was at that time in 1984, it was a not a dangerous, but certainly a scary kind of proposition. Fred described Sophie as absolutely fearless. The KGB followed them around wherever they went, but she was determined to show support for the refuseniks who were really suffering in Russia, and she was very proud of that. She was very proud of being Jewish. She always identified as a Jewish grandma. She never in any way hid that identity and was very proud of it. And gastronomically, she was very Jewish. She had no fresh vegetables. In her personal papers, there was recipes for mandel bread and knishes and things like that. So
She's buried in New Light Cemetery.
okay, because New Light, thank you. New Light is a Romanian congregation. Her family were Romanian immigrants. Other questions, comments? Anything I said? Yes.
The story, when my mother-in-law lived in the Maxon Tower, Sophie lived there as well. So one night she's sitting in the lobby after I brought my mother-in-law back to the apartment, and she'd just been to China. I think it was late in Mayor Murphy's administration. The delegation went to China for economic development reasons. So Sophie went along with the group. And so I said, how was your trip to China? She said, it's a long way to go for some lousy food.
Well, I remember a story she told. She went to Japan, and she came back, and reporters were asking her, and she said she had to eat on the, get down on the floor practically. She was afraid she wouldn't be able to get up. And she had no idea what she was eating, but she didn't want to be the ugly American, so she never asked. There is a funny, going back to the Jewish bit, her staff, apparently once a week or fairly often, would have pork ribs that they would kind of get, and they would have it in the back of the office and kind of put aprons on over their suits and so forth, and it would be a fun little venture. And one day Sophie came in, and they were all, kind of like, Sophie, this is what we're doing and so forth. And she said, well, what are you eating? And they told her, and she sat down and had some, and she said, don't tell my rabbi. But she always had a joke or making light of things, and in politics it's necessary. Yes?
Do you think a lot of her personality could be attributed to her growing up in the Hill District, where she had experienced anti-Semitism and probably saw blacks, being treated differently? She probably learned a lot of tolerance.
She was very, she loved all kinds of people. It didn't matter, black, white, old, younger, and particularly in the black community. And I think Jake Mallions, as I said, was, and the Crawford Square was very important to her because A, it was part of her own neighborhood, and B, she knew that it would really energize that neighborhood. And that was really important. At one point, she was criticized by the black community, and she was very upset about that. Something went wrong, and she was criticized, and that really bothered her. She tried to really reach out. And that's what I'm saying about Sophie. She unified people. When Sophie, when the shooting at Tree of Life last year, I did write an op-ed that I put in the book, and I talked about how would Sophie have responded? And I think Sophie would have, if she were still mayor at that time, she would have really reached out to try to bring people together, to not build on fear and scapegoating and separating people. She really would have tried to make everybody come together, and I really feel that she was a great unifier, and that was one of the reasons why so many people loved her, I think. Any other kind of comment?
She mentioned her daughter. She just had the one daughter?
She had the one daughter, and the one daughter was very reluctant to get involved in any kind of public space. The husband was really a stay-at-home husband. He said, with my Sophie, anything's possible, but he never was there. He never went out. First of all, he was a sickly man. He was disabled, and he just was not a public figure. But he was very proud of Sophie. Sophie got home every night, pretty much, to make him dinner. She was a very devoted wife. And he was very supportive of her, but not out in front. So, no other questions? I hate to have this end. It's fun talking about Sophie.
And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and wish you a happy holiday season. And as our tradition, we'd appreciate if you could help bring your chair over the wrap.